I think a lot of leaders kind of get that decision making is part of the job. You know, we make 1,000 decisions every day. It seems like you're talking about more than just task level decisions. And we're really talking about life decisions and getting the right things and the big things in the right place, the big rocks, if you will. Is that kind of where we're coming from?
Yeah. And again, not every decision we make is life or death. In fact, most decisions we make are not all that important in the grand scheme of things. But the way we make decisions is generally pretty consistent. And so having the right decision-making filter in place for all of our decisions sets us up to make the right decisions when our decisions really count. And so it's really the habit and the patterns, how well we listen, who we listen to, and specifically what we're going to talk about a little bit is the questions that we ask. Because in the sort of random decisions we make, the super important decisions we make, wherever they fall on the spectrum, we are subconsciously and sometimes consciously asking ourselves questions that ultimately help us make our decisions. And one of the things that's so important for everybody, but maybe leaders in particular, is there is an extraordinarily important connection or correlation between the questions we ask and the decisions that we make. And in business, we've all heard this before. Perhaps some folks in your audience have actually said this before. On the back end of a bad decision, bad investment, maybe you hired somebody, and a month in, 3 months in, you're thinking, goodness, how what happened? And we sometimes even say, I should have asked more questions, or I should have asked better questions, because our decisions are really no better than the questions that we ask. So this connection between decisions and question asking is super important. So again, I love to help people think through the questions they're asking or the questions they should ask, because sometimes we even ask ourselves questions that lead to not so good decisions. So this is an important relationship.
Yeah, I love it. And I've heard it said that the quality of our life is in direct proportion to the quality of questions we're asking. So what are these questions we should be asking ourselves as leaders, especially when it comes to decision making?
Yeah, well, in my book, Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets, I suggest 5 questions. And again, I try to help readers understand the importance of this correlation between, as I just said, the questions we ask and the decisions we make. We all have a decision-making filter. We all do. And I think for many of us, we don't even know what it is. We ask ourselves, will this hurt me? Will this make me happy? Then we ask, will anyone find out? Is this habit forming? So there's some questions that really aren't all that helpful. But I suggest 5 questions that everybody should ask every time they make a decision. These are questions, in some cases, I learned from my dad, and I talk about that in the book. These are questions he began asking me very young. And then these are questions that I've discovered along the way that have been helpful for me personally and that I've taught my kids to ask. And the first question, I call it the integrity question. And the integrity question is, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And then for this one to really have some bite, you have to ask the word really. And I suggest people stand in front of the mirror and say, okay, why am I doing this really? Now, I've explained it to everybody else. I've justified it to everybody else. I've justified it to myself. But why am I doing this really? And I call it the integrity question, because this is the self-leadership question. For those of you who have employees, you know that it's very difficult to lead a liar. In fact, eventually you have to fire the liar. But all of us have a habit of lying to ourselves. And that's why at some point, it's hard to lead ourselves well as long as we're lying to ourselves. So we have to fire the internal liar. And one way to help overcome lying to ourselves is to be honest with ourselves. The integrity question, why am I doing this? Really? Why am I buying this? Really? Yeah. Why am I leasing this? Really? Why am I calling her? Really? Why am I wearing this? Really? So it's the self-leadership question. Second question, I call it the legacy question, because it has to do with our future. The legacy question is this: what story do I want to tell? What story do I want to tell? And this is so important. This is one that I drill down with my kids all the time. My kids are all in their 20s. 2 of them are married. But I've tried to say to them, as hard as it is for you to believe, this season that you're in, one day is going to be nothing more than a story that you tell. And the easiest illustration is, when somebody in our world asks us where we went to college or tell us about high school, isn't it amazing? We reduce high school and college to a sentence,
yes,
or two sentences. It's like in the moment, it's our whole world. Later on, we look back and it was just a chapter in our lives. So what story do I want to tell? When you're telling when you're describing this particular season of life, what story would you like to tell? When you talk about going through this divorce, when you talk about starting this company, when you talk about the early days of trying to, find capital to get a project going, when this is nothing more than a story that you tell, what story do you want to tell? So when we're in the midst of making a decision and it's as large as our whole life, it's easy to forget that we're writing a story, and this is just one chapter in the story of our life. Mm-hmm. So when I'm telling this story, what story do I want to tell? The legacy question. The third question, I call it the conscience question. The conscience question is this: is there a tension? Is there a tension that deserves my attention? And this, for leaders, this is another question that's so important for leaders, because leaders have a leadership intuition. Some people say you can develop it, that anybody can become a leader. I'm not so sure. In my experience, there are people who just have a natural internal leadership intuition. And so this is an important question for leaders. Is there a tension that deserves my attention? And here's what I mean by that. We're in the middle of making a decision. Everything looks good on paper. Everybody's all for it. Everybody's bought in. This is what everybody in our industry is doing. This is what all my friends are doing, whatever it might be. But there's just something on the inside that's like a red flag. It's something that causes us to pause, and we don't know what it is, and it doesn't make any sense. And here's the hard thing: and there's no information to make this make any sense. There's just an internal tension. So one of the most important questions we can ask when we're making a big decision, especially a decision that involves other people, is there a tension? Is there something inside of me that's like, you know what? I know what you're saying. I know what it looks like. I know that this is industry standard. I know, but there's just something inside of me that's causing me to pause. And so in the book, I say, look, don't brush by that, don't rush by that, and don't ignore it.
Yes.
Let it get as big as it can possibly get. Is there a tension that deserves my attention?
I'm curious about the tension, because we hear from leaders all the time who are making decisions and they feel that flag, that spidey sense. And it's often this challenge of deciphering whether that's fear or wisdom. When there's a tension, it could be either of those things. When you say let it get big and slow down and pay attention to that, I imagine we're trying to spend some time there to figure out, is this fear, is it wisdom? Because you may end up going with it after you've slept on it or prayed over it, right? But how do you know? How do you pull that apart?
Well, generally, what I tell people is when you're feeling pressured from the outside to rush a decision, then you just need to hit pause. Because generally speaking, most decisions we're feeling pressure to make, there's not as much of a rush as other people want us to feel. So if you don't have to make the decision, just wait. Just as long as, if you're not 100% on the inside, because here's the thing about leadership, everybody, if you're the point person in an organization and everybody in the organization is for the decision, but you're the point person, you're the one that not only has to make it, you're the one that has to market it and defend it. And if it goes bad, it's your reputation, not theirs. Yeah. I mean, they can all go work for somebody else. It's your name on the line. So if I'm not willing to stand up and 100% sell something or move the organization in a direction or represent the organization in a direction, if there's an internal tension, I've got to wrestle that to the ground. Maybe not everybody else in the organization, but I have to. And you're exactly right, Daniel. Sometimes it is fear. Sometimes it's something else. So the point of the question is to be honest. Is there a tension that deserves my attention?
I love that.
In the book, I give several illustrations, but for those of you us in leadership, this one is not in the book. This may be relevant. When we built our first building, our first church building, we had the meeting with the architects and the designers and the contractor, where everybody, there's this plans, these giant, they don't call them blueprints anymore, but all these CAD drawings. And we had to go through and initial the corner of every single page on those big thick plans, because we're saying to the architect and to the contractor, we're signing off on this plan. This is what we want to build, right? So this is common, practice. So we sat there and went through the whole thing. We all initialed everything, everything. We're finished. We're about to build our first building. And there was a guy on our leadership team, actually one of our elders. He was not on staff, just a business guy who was part of our team. And I talk about in the book that sometimes the hesitation is so small that we're not even aware of it until somebody else asks a question, and suddenly it flares up big. And that's what happened in this case. So we're about to end the meeting, and we had a phase 1 and a phase 2, and we just signed off on phase 1. At the end of the meeting, we've put our initials on everything. Reggie Campbell, who has since gone to be with the Lord, Reggie said, "Before we leave, Andy, can I ask you a question?" I'm like, "Sure." He said, "I want you to imagine that we've just had our first worship service in our brand new building." This was our first building. We had hardly any money. This is our first building. He said, "We've just finished our first service in this building. When you're leaving the building and walking out to your car, what do you think you're going to feel?" Now, what an irrelevant question based on the meeting that we've just had. And here's the first thing that came to my mind. I said, "I think I'm going to wish we had built the second phase."
Oh, wow.
And we brought out the second phase after about 45 minutes of discussion, and we all initialed those plans as well, and we built both. All of that, this wasn't a huge decision, and it was the right decision. But I was, to your point, Daniel, there was a little bit of fear. We talked about doing both, but, it's a lot of money, and are we sure? We're a brand new church. But somebody asking that question sort of fueled that sense of, I wonder if we should just, bite off more than we're biting off right now. And it was the right decision, but it took somebody to bring it up. And again, it just kind of fueled that. So in leadership, it's so important to listen. We say, we talk about that all the time. Leaders who refuse to listen will eventually be surrounded by people who have nothing helpful to say. So there's this is a multifaceted thing, but the bottom line is there a tension that deserves my attention? Is it a tension I've been living with, or is it a tension that someone else's question raised in me? But the worst thing we can do is just ignore that tension. Moving on. The fourth question is a question my dad asked 10,000 times growing up. It's actually a question I have written an entire book about. And the question is, what is the wise thing to do? And I call this the maturity question, because it takes a lot of maturity to live our lives within the guardrails of wisdom. What's the wise thing to do, rather than within the guardrails of what's the legal thing to do, what's the ethical thing to do, what's the right thing to do, what's the moral thing to do. And our tendency, of course, is to live right on the line of immoral, unethical, unhealthy. We all have a tendency to do that. But mature people don't do that. They ask the better question: what is the wise thing to do? And I tease this out in 3 dimensions. In light of my past experience, what is the wise thing to do? In light of my current circumstances, my current state of mind, what is the wise thing to do? And this is the big one, in light of my future hopes and dreams, what is the wise thing to do? And as a pastor, perhaps nothing breaks my heart more than watching people undermine their own future. And people undermine their own future, their own relationship with their kids, their own marriage, their own companies, their own, professional lives. They undermine it, but not by making bad decisions initially. They undermine it by making a series of unwise decisions. Because our greatest regrets, whether it was an event or a season of life, our greatest regrets are always preceded by a series of unwise decisions. That one decision we wish we could go back and unmake, that one weekend wish we could go back and relive. I promise you, it was preceded not by a series of immoral, unethical, illegal decisions. It's always preceded by a series of unwise decisions. So the maturity question is, what is the wise thing for me to do? And then the last question is different. The fifth one This is the relational question. And unlike the other four, there's a return on investment with the other four. If you write a story you love to tell, there's a return on investment. If you do the wise thing, there's a return on investment. If you pay attention to that tension, there's a return on investment. But on this question, this is the question that will cost you something. It's the relationship question. And the relationship question is, what does love require of me? What does love require of me? When two people or two parties are both willing to ask that question, there's almost nothing relationally you can't overcome. What does love require of me? And this isn't the soft, mushy, what do I get out of it kind of love. As a Christian, this is the love demonstrated when God sent his son to do something that required a great deal of him. And Christian love and actual love always requires something of us. And so this is the relationship question. For the sake of the person on the other side of me, for the person I'm in relationship with, for the group of people I'm in relationship with, what does love require of me? So these 5 questions, I say better decisions, fewer regrets, because if you stop and are willing to ask these 5 questions, you will make better decisions, and consequently, you will live with fewer regrets.